In the late 1990s, the Mexican government sent an expedition to a small, uninhabited island in the Gulf of Mexico known as Bermeja, which had been appearing on maps of the region since the 16th century. The country was in the midst of negotiating a treaty with the United States, and Bermeja was important to establishing Mexico's maritime boundary, and the rights to any oil that might exist within that boundary. But when the ships got to Bermeja's supposed location, they found zilch. Nada. Nothing but an empty sea. Theories abound about what happened to Bermeja. Some have suggested that it was covered by rising sea levels. Others believe that it was taken out by a geological landslide. Conspiracy theorists think there was a plot by the US government or the CIA to destroy the island to increase the maritime territory and oil rights of the United States. But an analysis done in the late 2000s, when Mexico searched for the island again, showed that there hadn't been an island in that location for more than 5,000 years. Which means that it's possible those 16th century cartographers were wrong. They drew an island that never existed, making Bermeja a phantom island. Hi, I'm Erin McCarthy, editor-in-chief of Mental Floss, and this is The List Show. When it comes to phantom islands, Bermeja is just the beginning. In fact, old maps are rife with them. Sometimes these non-existent landmasses come about because of mistakes made by sailors or cartographers. Sometimes they can be traced back to folklore or legends. And sometimes there's an optical illusion at play. On today's episode, we're going to be covering all manner of phantom islands, from lands supposedly spotted by famous explorers to the Isle of Demons. Let's get started. Robert Peary really wanted to be the first person to make it to the North Pole. The Arctic explorer tried in 1893 to 95, 1898 to 1902, and again in 1905 to 1906. When the third expedition failed, Peary wanted to make another go at it right away, but he couldn't because he was out of money. He approached his previous backers again, even naming a previously undiscovered landmass after one of them. George Crocker became the namesake of Crocker Land, which was located 130 miles northwest of Cape Thomas Hubbard. Unfortunately for Peary, Crocker didn't cough up any cash. Instead, he used his money to aid San Francisco after its devastating 1906 earthquake. Peary did make it back to the Arctic, however, and ultimately claimed to have made it to the North Pole in 1909, though his claim was met with some serious polar explorer drama. Before Peary could publicly claim victory in the race for the pole, a rival explorer, Frederick Cook, said he'd gotten to the pole a year before Peary said he did. The two men duked it out in the press for months, with Cook ultimately saying that not only did Peary not make the pole, Crocker Land also didn't exist. Peary's people were not going to take this lying down. Donald McMillan, who had served as an assistant to Peary the year he said he'd reached the pole, put together an expedition to prove Crocker Land's existence. McMillan and his crew searched without luck for Crocker Land until one day in April, when a member of the expedition finally spotted a new landmass. McMillan later wrote, "We ran to the top of the highest mound. There could be no doubt about it. Great heavens, what a land! Hills, valleys, snow-capped peaks extending through at least 120 degrees of the horizon." Imagine how they must have felt when that long-sought-for island began to shift and change before their eyes until, eventually, it disappeared completely. What they had seen was a fata morgana, a mirage caused by light bending through air of different temperatures. A lot more happened after that, including the murder of an indigenous guide by a member of the expedition that was covered up, but the TLDR is that McMillan and some of his men ended up stuck in the Arctic for years before they were eventually rescued. They never found Crocker Land. As for what Peary saw, some believe he didn't actually see anything at all, and instead made Crocker Land up in a bid to get funding. His notes from that day don't mention the landmass, neither did the diaries of any of the others on the expedition. And perhaps most tellingly, neither did early drafts of Nearest the Pole. The island only popped up in the final book. Before we move on, it feels fair that we mention Cook also said he saw a new landmass in 1908 as he was trying for the pole, which he dubbed Bradley Land after one of his financial backers. It was supposedly a few degrees to the north of Crocker Land and consisted of two landmasses, which Cook described as snow-covered, ice-sheeted, and desolate. But it was real land with all the sense of security solid Earth can offer. Spoiler alert, it was not real land. Like Crocker Land, Bradley Land did not exist. In his 1832 book, A Narrative of Four Voyages to the South Sea, North and South Pacific Ocean, Chinese Sea, Ethiopic and Southern Atlantic Ocean, Indian and Antarctic Ocean from the year 1822 to 1831, Captain Benjamin Morrell dubbed himself the discoverer of countries the very existence of which was before unknown to the civilized world. One of the things he claimed to have discovered in the Pacific Ocean was Byers' Island, likely named after one of his financial backers. Are you sensing a pattern here? Anyway, Morrell described the island as moderately elevated and about 4 miles in circumference with some bushes and spots of vegetation. Among the wildlife found on the island were seabirds, green turtles, and what he called sea elephants, aka elephant seals. The island did appear on a few maps along with a question mark, and though it warranted mention in an 1899 guidebook, that book also noted that Byers' Island, along with another island Morrell discovered that was named after him, had not been seen for many years, and it is quite possible that the discoverers' positions were so much in error that what they really saw were the western islands of the Hawaiian group. It's also possible that they were simply made up, along with many of the other things featured in Morrell's book, which was probably ghost-written. What's most fascinating about this story is Morrell himself. In 1830, he found himself in the Carteret Islands, where, long story short, he declared war on the native population and eventually took 2 locals prisoner, dragging them on the voyage with him all the way back to New York, where, heavily in debt, Morrell put his 2 captives on stage in a show called Two Cannibals of the Islands of the South Pacific. A few years later, he went back to sea, got accused of piracy, and eventually died a fugitive in the 1830s, though some believe he may have staged his own death. Where is this guy's movie? Okay, it's Demonic Island time. The Isle of Demons first showed up on 16th century maps, where it sat off the coast of Newfoundland. It was said to be shrouded in mist, and as André Thevet wrote in his 1575 book Universal Cosmography, anyone who came near was buffeted by a great tempest, and they heard in the air, about the tops and the masts of their vessels, human voices making a great din, but there was no form to their speech, only such a murmuring as you might hear in the middle of a public hall on a market day. One map made in 1556 by Giacomo Gastaldi showed an abundance of life on the island, including trees, birds, and little horned and winged demons that, according to legend, would attack passing ships. In 1542, a noblewoman named Marguerite de la Roque and her lover, as well as her servant, ended up on the island when they were kicked off their ship after their affair was discovered. They built a hut and later recounted how the island's demons, disguised as terrifying beasts, attempted to rip it down. At night, they heard otherworldly screeching. Everyone but Marguerite eventually died. She was rescued by a passing fishing boat after living alone for a year. Sailors wholeheartedly believed the island was haunted, so they were obviously terrified of it and avoided it at all costs. The island remained on maps for a century or so before people realized it didn't exist, though there are theories that it might have been an island in the area like Harpoon Island. By the late 16th century, the Isle of Demons was already split off from the island that Marguerite was stranded on, with the latter being called Île de la Demoiselle, which is a real island in modern Quebec, though some think she was further south at modern-day Harrington Island. As for the more fantastical elements, some have theorized that the inhuman voices sailors heard may have been colonies of seabirds, and the beasts Marguerite encountered, wild animals like walruses, which she was likely to have never seen before. Hy-Brasil was a small island that was said to sit off the west coast of Ireland. According to legend, it was visible just once every 7 years, after which it was cloaked by fog. Hy-Brasil, which also went by names like Brazil, O Brazil, the Enchanted Island, and the Isle of the Blessed, may or may not have originated in Irish folklore since it first appears on a 14th century Italian map. But no matter what, it's become deeply associated with Ireland. Sailors who saw it while at sea reported attempting to approach it through the fog, but never being able to make it to shore. According to one bit of hearsay, a crew got lost in the fog and ended up on the island, where they found a castle. They knocked on the door, but no one answered. The next day, they were approached by a very ancient grave gentleman and his servants, who threw them a feast and proclaimed that the island was called O Brazil, that his ancestors were sometimes princes of it, telling them also that he and several persons of quality, by the malicious diabolical art of a great necromancer, had been tyrannically shut up in the castle they knocked at yesterday. The gentleman helped to get them out of Hy-Brasil's harbor and back on their way. Unfortunately for Hy-Brasil, its days were numbered. According to a post by Cynthia Smith, a reference specialist in the Geography and Map Division at the Library of Congress, as maritime traffic increased, cartographers began to doubt its existence. British cartographer Thomas Jeffries called it the imaginary Isle of O Brazil on a 1753 map, but even then it remained on maps for another 120 years before finally disappearing. And not just for 7 years this time. In the 16th and 17th centuries, cartographers studying maps of the North Atlantic would have seen an island south of Iceland called Frisland. How this island, which does not exist, came to be is a fascinating story. It starts with the Venetian senator Niccolò Zeno, who in 1558 anonymously published the story of his forebears Niccolo and Antonio, who were navigators in the 14th century. Writing to Antonio, Niccolo recounted how his ship had wrecked on Frisland, which was ruled by a man named Signy. He promptly made Niccolo the admiral of his fleet and ordered him to invade Iceland. He failed at that mission, but apparently attacked a few other islands and eventually made it all the way to Greenland. Niccolo invited Antonio to come and live on Frisland with him, and Antonio accepted. In the second set of letters, Antonio, writing to their brother Carlo, a Venetian merchant, described his adventures as admirable of Signy's fleet after Niccolo's death. Yes, those adventures include cannibals. The book also included a map that would come to be known as the Zeno map. Some believe the book proves that the Zeno brothers made it to North America 100 years before Columbus. Although there are a number of theories floating around out there about Frisland, including that Signy was a Scottish nobleman named Henry Sinclair, Earl of Orkney, it seems more probable that the whole thing was a hoax. In his book, The European Discovery of America, The Northern Voyages, AD 500 to 1600, maritime historian Samuel Eliot Morrison dismissed the Sinclair story outright and noted that Frederick W. Lucas published an entire book that raked the Zeno Signy craft fore and aft with historical and geographical facts, reducing the story to shreds as far as reputable history is concerned in 1898. Hoax or no, the Zeno map would prove to be hugely influential. Many famous cartographers incorporated it into their own maps, including Jurridus Mercator, the guy behind the Mercator projection. According to Morrison, the Zeno map befuddled cartographers for over a century. Let's finish up with a phantom island reported by one of the most famous explorers of all time. In December 1577, Sir Francis Drake left England on the Pelican on a mission to find out places meet to have traffic. For the next 3-ish years, he circumnavigated the globe, stopping in plenty of far-flung locales while indulging in a bit of piracy not officially authorized by the crown. When he made his way past the southern tip of South America through the Strait of Magellan, they encountered severe storms, forcing Drake to take cover near an island that became known as Elizabeth Island. You'll be familiar with what happened next by now. Elizabeth Island was added to maps and stayed there until the mid-18th century, but other explorers making their way through the Strait of Magellan never saw it. Some think that Drake actually landed on Hornos Island, but in his 1939 book Cape Horn, marine historian Felix Reisenberg hypothesized that Drake had found Elizabeth Island and had vanished later. Recent earthquakes in Chile show what might have easily happened at the southernmost peak of that huge chain of craters. The island of Elizabeth might have been blown to kingdom come a year or so after Francis Drake left its haven. The second alternative is that the centuries, having already reduced the peak, might have grounded away under bombardment of the heaviest and hardest icebergs of the seas, pounding against it relentlessly in the huge Cape Horn seas. That's it for this episode of The List Show. There are a lot of other phantom islands we didn't have room for in this video, so feel free to tell us all about your favorites in the comments. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.